the Jews theologically are remarkably close to Islam. They have a concept of Tawheed that is total. God is one, indivisible, not a trinity, has no brothers, sisters, uncles, aunties, no sons. God is one, cannot be divided. This itself was enough that the prophet was good to Jews. Now, we know that there were 3 tribes in Medina that one after the other had a falling out with the prophet. So we've developed in our mind some kind of notion that he didn't like Jews because they were Jews. And that couldn't be further from the truth, as I mentioned. When he came into Medina, he knew he was entering what was largely a Jewish town. It wasn't a polytheistic town with a few Jews. It was the other way around. It was a Jewish town with a few polytheistic Arabs. And he knew that north of Medina, all the way to the border of Sham, were Jews. And all those towns that I mentioned before. And yet, we know this, that even after fighting against the 3 tribal groups within Medina, and that's over authority of the oasis of Medina. It's nothing to do with the religious confession. He maintains good relations with those Jewish tribes all over. And in fact imposes upon them something called jizya. Now we know the rate of jizya because it's stated in our sources. Each Jewish person was to pay to the Islamic, to the prophet as part of their agreement with him, the amount of 1 dinar per person, which is equal to 11.5 dirhams. That's it. And if you think about how much zakat the Muslims themselves were paying, boy, it paid to be a Jew and pay this greatly reduced amount. It was a soft and easy and accommodating amount. It was a political statement that you're contributing to the ummah, to the community.
Right.
It wasn't designed to be an onerous or an exploitative, heavy amount of taxation. So in answer to your question, the other monotheistic peoples were treated pretty well by the prophet. He was quite affectionate towards a monk, for example, or monks. And there's a word in Arabic means those who have the tonsure. A tonsure is when in the Middle Ages or in antiquity, a priest would shave the top of their head. You've seen Friar Tuck and Robin Hood, and they have this strange ring like this. The prophet thought it was very curious that they did this. Didn't stop them doing it. But he said to his people, when you go out on these expeditions and you come across them, don't harm them. Leave them alone because they're devoted to Allah. They're devoted like you cannot believe. They put themselves away in these cloisters. They deprive themselves of the earthly pleasures to be close to Allah. Leave them alone. And so that was the position. And likewise, for example, during the Battle of Khaybar, he fights against the Jews there. And then he imposes upon them. They come to him and say, look, can we cut a deal and stop all this fighting? He says, yes, of course. But you have to pay the jizya. They say, we'll pay it. Then they say to him, you know, you've taken our holy books, the Torah, all our scrolls you've taken. And the prophet said, what do you mean? They're missing? He then sends his men out to find them and says, return them. They're the books of God. Return them. Now, he doesn't say, oh, these terrible books, you should stop reading them. Because they're the books of Islam as well. They're the books of revelation. And he's upset that his people have done something with them. So they quickly recovered and handed back to the Jews of Khaybar. It's actually quite a beautiful moment.
On that question, towards the end of the Prophet's life, the Conquest of Mecca, of course, a very famous event. What happened there, and what does it tell us about Muhammad as a political and military leader? Because one would assume, from a certain Western point of view, that when Muhammad actually conquered Mecca, his home city, his hometown, defeated his enemies, what would he do? I mean, some people might say, he would have slaughtered them. Of course, that's what he would have done. But interesting, at the height of his power, when he had the power to impose his will militarily on his enemies, his bitterest enemies in Mecca, what actually happened on that occasion, according to our sources?
Well, again, it's hard to know exactly. The sources are quite detailed, but clearly there's been a lot of coloring in the sources. That, there's a very symbolic, rounded up figure of 10,000 soldiers that marched from Medina to Mecca. There's a highly improbable figure. And the fact that it's exactly 10,000 and rounded up perfectly, and each of the composite parts are numbered.
Yeah.
It's not 10,001, it's not 973, it's exactly 10,000. Well, but it's a large force. Let's say whatever it is, it moves up. It takes a week and a bit to get there. The Meccans are freaking out. They know he's coming. Abu Sufyan, one of the leaders of the Quraysh, goes to the Prophet.
He's one of the enemies of the Prophet, of course, the arch enemy.
Well, it's a strange thing you say that, because I'm very fond of Abu Sufyan. His name is Abu Sufyan, the son of war, Harb. And his father's name was War. People think that it's an epithet to insult him, that he somehow loves war. No, it isn't. It's an esteemed name. His father was a great warrior. So his father's name is War. And so Abu Sufyan, the son of War, it's a tribute to his father. He's the Prophet's second cousin. He's 10 years older than the Prophet. He's a very grand figure, a very noble figure, a very dignified man. The Prophet's terribly impressed by his personal bearing. And so when he comes to the Prophet is sweet to him and says, Abu Sufyan, isn't it time that you said La ilaha illallah, that there's only one God and that it's Allah? And he says, I say it, cousin. I say it, La ilaha illallah. Then it's interesting. They say to Abu Sufyan, the Prophet says to Abu Sufyan, but what about me? What do you say of me? And Abu Sufyan says, look, I knew you when you were a child. I don't know. I don't know. Now, this is when the Prophet is immensely powerful. He's moving forward with thousands and thousands of men. And this Quraysh tribal leader, who's led 2 or 3 major attacks against him, is saying to him, I'll believe in your God, but I'm not sure about you, oh cousin, because I remember you as a little boy. So you would think that this would offend the dignity of the Prophet. He'd be angry. The Prophet left it at that and didn't demand the recognition of the Prophet as a prophet. So there's an agreement takes place. We don't know how the agreement takes place, where the Prophet says to Abu Sufyan, go home and tell your people that this won't be bad for them if they seek your protection. And Abu Sufyan was a tribal leader, and a tribal leader at that time had the right to declare safety, the safety of their people. And in their name, the other tribal leader against him would have to honor that. And Muhammad did exactly according to Arabic tribal custom. He honored Abu Sufyan's declaration that the people beneath me, Abu Sufyan, are safe. The phrase is, those in my home, those who are in my house. And it doesn't mean literally, physically, his own little private space. It means the people beneath Abu Sufyan are safe. And so the Prophet, when he gets to Mecca, he divides his force into 3 or 4 great columns. One goes down to the south. One goes in through each of the 2 western gates, and one comes from the north, where the Prophet himself is, peace be upon him. And the Meccans, except for one small group of resistors, all submit. And the Prophet calls them all together in front of the Kaaba. And all of the men come in a great massive of Meccans, and all the females come all clumped together as a separate group. And the Prophet from the steps of the Kaaba says, what am I going to do with you? And it's like a rhetorical question. And they're clever. You see, we forget that they were monotheists there and that they knew scriptures. And so they appealed to him on the basis of like what had happened in the Bible when
Joseph with his brothers.
With Joseph and his brothers. And he repeats the scripture and says, you are forgiven and there's no harm upon you this day. And they rejoice in that. And so it's quite a moment of reconciliation. What he does then is he takes the bayah, the pledge of allegiance of all of the men. They come and they shake his hand. And he asks two things. The bayah involves two things. One is to listen and to what's required. The second is to obey what's been asked. So the prophet says, come and listen. They all come and listen. And individually he shakes their hand. And they promise to obey. And to every man, the prophet added the phrase, well, as best you can. They said, oh, prophet, we promise to obey you. And he was kind of soft and said, well, do your best, the best you can. But the interesting thing is that some of the men are reluctant to make the bayah to him or reluctant to become Muslims. And there had been this triumvirate of leaders in Mecca who had actively resisted him. And to each of them, the prophet extended forgiveness. Now, the curious thing is that there were a number of death sentences that had already been preordained upon some of the Meccans. And so the prophet expected that those people would be found somewhere. They'd probably still be intransigent or stubborn and wouldn't accept. And among them was a woman called Hind binti Utbah, who was actually the wife of Abu Sufyan. And her son, her father and her uncle had all been killed in the Battle of Badr. And she had sought vengeance against the prophet and had been instrumental in having the prophet's uncle Hamza killed and mutilated.
Indeed.
And so there was a death sentence hanging over her. Now, the curious thing is she came in amongst all of these women and she was covered with a niqab. No one could see who it was. And so the prophet started saying to the ladies, now, ladies, it's your turn to make the bayah to me. We won't do this with a handshake. You do it with a pledge to me, and I'll accept that. So he says, but I have a few requests for you. You are not to bury your children in the sand. Don't kill your children. And this voice calls out, well, you've just killed our sons and our brothers. Who are you to talk about killing? The most disrespectful thing you can imagine. And the prophet is patient and continues. And talks about, and men, be just to your wives. And this woman calls out, well, what of my husband is a stingy man, and he won't give me money from his wallet. And the prophet says, well, then you can take some, but only take what's required and fair. Then this man calls out from the audience and says, oh, messenger of God, forgive my wife and her big mouth. Who is it? It's Abu Sufyan.
Oh, really?
Which means that the prophet immediately knows that this woman who's being very disrespectful and heckling him is Hind bint Utbah, who's got a death sentence upon her. And he says, is that you, Hind? And she says, yes, it is. And then he says, and you are forgiven. And she was struck by that, as if lightning had hit her. And later she talked about the powerful effect of the fact that she was still bitter. She had been heckling the man who had taken her city, who had killed her son, who had killed her father, who had killed her uncle. And he says to her, you are forgiven. And she felt forgiven. And she became a very great Muslim, as did Abu Sufyan. So this moment of healing was quite remarkable. But there were some who nonetheless was stubbornly held out. And one of them came to the prophet and said, can I have 3 months to make up my mind about you? And the prophet said, sure, take 4 months. Take as long as you like. Others fled. Some went to Jeddah. Some went down towards the Yemen. And the prophet sent riders after them, tell them to come back. They're forgiven. And some of them, there was one of them was getting a boat, wanted to cross across the sea to Abyssinia. And a friend came and said, I finally caught up with you here. Thank goodness. The prophet sent me to get you and fetch you back. And he said, am I going to be killed? He said, no, you're going to be forgiven. Come back, talk to him. He's going to forgive you. And so in that moment, there's this kind of remarkable healing And you know, from there they had to march out to Hunain to fight a very great battle. And so the Prophet even took on his campaign many of these people who weren't yet Muslims, some of them who hadn't made their pledge of allegiance to him, were still holding out. He said, come, fight, get a share of the booty. They're like, you want us to join your military? He said, come. And so they went out and were transformed by this sense of trust. And of course, then they won the battle, they got booty, and they received it. And so they were, you know, by every measure of Arab custom, they understood that they were fully incorporated as truly forgiven allies of the Prophet.
Remarkable story.